Pete and Allie here from Two Tiny Wings. First thing is you might notice that we are at our home base and not at one of the parks for a report on our Takumi-Tei dining experience. The reason is once we kind of got out of the experience, the park was way past closed. And as you'll see from the environment when we talk about our experience in the restaurant, it wasn't really the kind of place where we were comfortable kind of talking to the camera and making a whole lot of noise during the experience. So we decided to kind of digest the meal and then come back and give our thoughts after.
Definitely.
Yeah. So the first thing that we want to talk about is where this restaurant is. If you are looking at the Japan Pavilion and Mitsukashi is on the left, Takumi-Tei is kind of tucked away right to the right of the pavilion. It is incredibly, incredibly serene.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like when you arrive, your arrival is very peaceful. It's very relaxing. You get right from when you walk in, you're welcomed by the staff that's at the front on the outside, and then when you go onto the inside, you're welcomed by another person, and then they give you a little bit of an introduction to what the restaurant is all about, and you immediately realize that you're in for a dining experience as opposed to just I'm sitting at this restaurant having a meal like you would pretty much anywhere else in the park.
One of the first things that I noticed is you don't feel like you are in a theme park. You're greeted by the hostesses, and they are wearing traditional kimono and obi, and like Pete said, you're brought into the restaurant and they explain to you the theming inspiration, and every single room is themed after one of the natural elements. We have wood, earth, water, stone, and washi paper. If you want to sit at the chef's table, that's going to be your water room. So after you get the inspiration explanation, you're then taken to your table. We were seated in the wood room. One of the first things that I noticed was how everything in the wood room was carefully chosen, from the seats to the wood beams that were left raw, to the colors of the silverware, the colors of the table placemats. It was all very cohesive and very intentional.
And you're talking about the silverware, and that was one of my first things was the place setting, and the napkin was folded to look like the top of like a kimono, but then we kind of noticed that the silverware wasn't silver, it was more of like a goldish color,
like a rose gold.
And at first we were wondering if that was something related to how you eat or the flavors, and we kind of figured out as we went that no, that subtlety, we started to look around and we're thinking to ourselves, it would not look the same if it was silver as opposed to that goldish color. And so that level of detail as far as what you're experiencing in the meal, every little component is taken care of. And I noticed that as soon as you look at the place setting, you're like, wow, this is different.
So after we sat down and kind of took in where we were at, our serving team started to come and take our order, and what they do a really good job of is taking you through the menu. There are a couple of different options. They have a sushi selection, there are appetizers and main courses and desserts, and then there's also a tasting menu where you can choose. It's a 6-course menu with a bunch of different samplings.
And that's what both Mary and myself ended up going with. Part of it because it gave, for me, a variety of the different offerings at the restaurant, but then also it was more part of the experience of a composed meal from start to finish that the chef had in mind for that dining experience at that restaurant.
So I ended up getting an appetizer to share with Aiden, and then I got the Japanese A5 Wagyu tenderloin. Aiden got a Jackman Farms American Wagyu strip steak, and then as Pete said, he and Mary both got the tasting menu. The first thing that came out, which we didn't necessarily know would come out, was a little amuse-bouche, and this was a mushroom tofu with dehydrated mushrooms on top, and then there were also some microgreens, and we each got one of those.
And I think this is something, if I remember correctly, that it changes periodically, so it's every let's say couple of weeks maybe. So you won't necessarily get the same amuse-bouche, and it's not even something that's on the menu. It's just when you sit down, that is what everyone at the table gets. We got it on the tasting menu, but even though they didn't get the tasting menu, they got that same selection.
I am a really big fan of mushrooms. I would never have considered myself a fan of tofu. One of the things that sticks with me even now is that, well, I watch a lot of cooking shows. I'm a big fan of Top Chef, and so you constantly hear about what a composed dish is, where you're kind of mixing textures. And I never really understood that until this particular bite. It was silky, smooth, creamy mousse from the tofu, but then you got to the crunch of the microgreens and the crunch of the dehydrated mushrooms, and so there was a very subtle mushroomy taste, but then there were also crunchy, zingy notes from the greens. It was stunningly good.
And that was the same basic thing that I took away from it. More just than just the flavor, but was the texture. Mushrooms tend to be kind of earthy, and it wasn't very heavy on the mushroom flavor. It was subtle enough that you got the mushroom flavor without it being overpowering. But again, the texture of these microgreens, it was just enough that it changed it, so it wasn't just the mousse texture. It gave it that extra level of both texture and flavor, which was really cool.
If you've ever had the gray stuff cupcake over at Be Our Guest, how they put those little pearls on top of the icing and they give the icing a little bit of a different crunch, it's kind of like that as when we're talking about the texture. So that was a wonderful, wonderful way to start off the meal. And from there, Aiden and I shared the agadashi tofu. And this was another tofu, which again, I never would have thought that I would be ordering. It was fried tofu squares on top of a bed of brown butter black rice with some mushrooms and daikon tsukimono. Pardon my pronunciation if I butchered that. And then it also had carrot ginger puree and fried lotus roots. So the first thing that I noticed was the smell coming off of this dish. It smelled absolutely phenomenal. I am not an adventurous eater, and putting all of these things together sounded rather scary, but it was so good. You had the crunchiness of the outside of the fried tofu, which then gave a nice complement to the almost al dente black rice, but then you had the sweet nuttiness of the butter, and then the sauce was incredibly sweet with the crunchiness of the lotus root. It was absolutely phenomenal. If I hadn't had the mushroom amuse-bouche like right before, this would have been the best thing that I'd ever eaten in my entire life. So this is the second best thing at this point in the meal that I've ever eaten in my entire life. And I would have licked the bowl if we weren't in a very, very fancy restaurant. It was absolutely phenomenal.
And so at this stage of the tasting menu, I got the sushi before the appetizers. These sushi bites were simply just the best sushi I've ever had. It was very simple, but exquisitely prepared, perfectly prepared rice. The fish was just amazingly fresh. If you're worried about, hey, I'm not a big sushi person, I think it's going to be too fishy, it wasn't. It was the kind of thing where you can tell it's very high quality, so it's very, you're not getting that overpowering fishy flavor, and then the little bit of wasabi and soy that you can add to your bite just made it was perfect. I could have, afterwards I thought I could come in here and just order a bunch of sushi and have a fantastic meal. That's how good it was. And then when the appetizer that they ordered came out, the appetizer on the tasting menu was a Nikomi Wagyu braised Wagyu bone marrow appetizer. It's basically served on a sectioned bone, and it's a mixture of the bone marrow, the braised Jack Far's Wagyu short rib, and some other kind of bibs and bobs to add some different flavors to the dish. The thing that I thought was neat about this is not only the presentation of all this stuff is really, really cool, but what was neat was and especially after we started, Mary and I took the first bite or so, the server came up, and this is again part of the experience too, the server came up and kind of gave us some recommendations on how to eat it. And she basically said, take the spoon, take some of the bone marrow and the braised short rib, and then take a little bit of the other components that are on the dish to find kind of your mixture that you want out of the bite. And as soon as Mary and I did that, we were like, oh my gosh. And we just basically gobbled the whole thing down, because it was all of a sudden you saw all these different components that the chef intended to get out of the dish come together. Following the appetizer course of the meal, they give you a small spoonful of something that ends up serving as a palate cleanser. And we wanted to bring in Mary, because she said this was one of her favorite parts of the meal, to give you her thoughts on the palate cleanser. So if you want to tell us a little bit about what was in the palate cleanser, and then kind of what you thought of it.
In the palate cleanser, it was basically a spoon, and it had a cube of melon, ginger, and some shaved ice. And you were supposed to eat it all in one bite, and basically what happened was you like chewed up the melon, and then the like ice melted and coated your entire mouth in ginger. So it was really just refreshing, and your just mouth tasted like not super like ginger, but enough where it was like, oh, I can't taste the fish of the sushi anymore.
And it served its purpose exactly as it was. It took your palate and it took away all of the different flavors you'd been experiencing for the last 20 minutes and got you ready for the next dish, which was really cool.
So after that palate cleansing course, it was now time for the main event. And like I said, I got the Japanese A5 Wagyu tenderloin. It came with onions and mushrooms, and it was absolutely amazing. You hear a lot about how tender Wagyu is. I could cut it with a spoon. That is how incredibly tender this steak was. It was seasoned, and so there was a little bit of salt, and the outside was all crusty. It was superb. It was worth every single penny. I mean, this place is not an inexpensive place to eat. We ended up going there because Mary wants to go into the culinary field, and so she absolutely loves Japan, and so we wanted to give her this authentic Japanese meal kind of experience. And you get to see how a dish is composed and how all of the elements work together. And so you have the beef, and then the mushrooms and the onions, and it was phenomenal.
And the tasting menu lets you try both the Jackman Farms, which is the American Wagyu, and the Japanese A5. And I guess the simplest way to say it is they are unique. The Japanese was tender and flavorful and better than any traditional steak, any steak you've ever had before. The Jackman Farms, I would say it tasted almost more buttery. It was more fatty, but I don't mean that in a bad way. It was the fat kind of was in the meat differently, and it made it taste more buttery, which was unique and delicious and wonderful. And it was neat to have both of them next to each other and taste the differences.
And then Aiden got the Jackman Farms Wagyu strip steak. And one of the cool things that our server told us was that in order for a steak to be certified Wagyu, 80% of its line needs to be Japanese Wagyu. Jackman Farms is in Florida, and so that's where the restaurant gets its beef for this particular offering. I think rather than having Aiden in here, his reaction that we did catch on film will speak for itself. So I'll put that in now.
This is the best thing I've ever tasted in my life.
So he absolutely loved it. And I think we all did. I mean, I think we were all just eating our meal very, very quiet because it was the most amazing thing we have ever had.
And with all of it, beyond just the Wagyu, but everything else, you want to enjoy every single bite and take it all in. Again, I've said it a couple of times probably already, but it's an experience as opposed to just a meal or food that you're eating. And so you want to envelop all the different experiences that you're taking out of that meal.
We came to dessert. Now, at this point, since it was opening night, we were at about 3 hours in. The time between the palate cleansing course and the main course, it was a long time. It was a good hour. But again, I've heard that other people since the opening night have had shorter experiences. So I wouldn't necessarily base your allotment of time on hours.
Some of the things I've seen is I think it's down to probably around an hour and a half or so for the whole experience if you're doing the tasting menu. Some of it may have been just getting used to managing the timing of the service of the tasting menu and bringing everything out in a coordinated fashion to keep that in mind.
So for dessert, I got the Kumo cloud cake, and it's yuzu cheesecake, spiced kabocha, candied yuzu gel, and blackberry sake. This, like everything else, had a bunch of different elements, and it changed how the dish tasted based on kind of which bite you put in your mouth at any given time. I love cheesecake. It was silky and smooth, but then you have like the bite of the kabocha, and then you put the blackberry in there, so there was a little bit of acid to it. So it wasn't just sweet cheesecake.
And with the tasting menu, you get the Japanese water cake. It's the Suryandani Water Lily Valley Japanese water cake with rose kurumitsu and kanako crumb. And I think the kanako crumb, we figured out it was a soybean-based crumble. It was, like everything else in the meal, very unique. The presentation of it was unique. It looks like a jello-y dome, but it doesn't have the texture of jello. It's just different. It's almost hard to describe without actually having to taste it. So having that experience of trying something that I don't know where else I would get a Japanese water cake other than there in my travels. So that was unique. If I had to say one thing, and this will sound more negative than it's meant to be, it would not have been my favorite part of the meal. It was different. It was different, it was unique. I'm glad it's part of that experience because it's something that I'm not going to get to have, but it was not something where I walked away that being the favorite part of the meal. But part of that is because so many of the other elements of that experience were so good that that's just the way it kind of it played out. But like I said, I'm glad I got to experience it.
So let's bring in Aiden. He is 14 years old, and so I think he can give a good perspective on what he thought of the meal.
We brought Aiden in. We wanted to give his perspective as well because some of you guys might have either teenage children or maybe even a little bit younger, and you're wondering how they might feel about the experience of the meal. So we thought we'd bring Aiden in and provide that perspective. So what were your thoughts, Aiden?
It was really good. Like the atmosphere was good. What room were we in? The wood room?
Wood room.
Yeah. They had like a bunch of different rooms about like different like elements and stuff. Like they had like a stone room, a water room. Yeah, it was really cool. The food was really good. Some of the best food I've ever had. I really liked the appetizer, like the little mushroom like cream thing that we had. And the steak was like some of the best steak I've ever had. The wait for all the food was a little long, but I guess that made sense since it was kind of like the first day of it opening and it's like a really fancy restaurant. So yeah.
So overall,
I would go back.
Cool.
One of the things I do want to mention is if you do have younger kids and this is something that you did want to try, the table next to us had little kids. I would say maybe under 10,
Yeah.
2 kids under 10. And they made them frushi. There was something else that they brought out for them.
Yeah, they
I want to
kinda-
say like
there isn't-
hamburger-ish.
There isn't a kids menu, but when they sat down, even I think the manager came over and they kind of figured out, they asked what they wanted and what kind of things they liked, and then they made it for them.
After the dessert, Pete and Mary's meal was not over yet because they had also had a traditional Japanese tea service as part of their meal. Now, since it was pretty obviously the first time that our servers had done this for guests, I didn't want to put the added pressure of a camera on them, so I didn't film it. But Pete, if you want to explain.
It was neat because a traditional Japanese tea ceremony can take hours. and it's got all these different elements, and they all have different meanings as far as the relationships that you're having with one another, and there's a lot of meaning to it. And so they basically put this in to give you a small flavor of that. She came out, and they have the matcha powder, and they put it in the hot water, and then there's certain ways you hold the bowl and you drink it a certain way. And overall, again, it's a dining experience, and it was this neat little capstone that you put on your meal experience to just, it's tea, so it's tea, but it was neat to have it's like reminding you of what you're doing there and why you're at that restaurant. Very neat.
And I think just like everything else that was put before us, every part of the tea service is very intentional. You turn the bowl a certain number of times, and then you drink, and then you pass. And so I think it very much characterized our experience with everything in the restaurant, from every bite of food to every room to every part of the service. So it was neat to get to see that in person. So after the tea service, Pete and Mary got this little bag, and in this little bag is some Japanese sugar candy. They actually sell this in Mitsukoshi, but you get this own little sweet reminder of the meal as it was put to us. So that's a neat little way to kind of end your meal and take something with you. This is just available with the tasting menu, so Aiden and I didn't get it, but this is my absolute favorite candy on the entire planet. So it was perfect. We walked out, and we came in when it was light. We left when it was dark. I'm kind of glad that we left after the park was closed, because it was such a calming experience. It would have been weird to kind of go back into the hustle and bustle of the theme park. I would go back in a second. Absolutely, 100% for the service, for the food, for the experience. As we said, it was not inexpensive. Their tasting menu was $130 a person. My beef was $93. Aiden's was $68. If you do not get the tasting menu, you can get your 10% annual pass holder discount, but that does not apply to the tasting menu.
My final thoughts would be, it's not on the dining plan, so you can't use credits. So if you're on the dining plan, it is an extra expense. But if you're not on the dining plan, we started to look at it and thought, all right, if I'm going to go to, say, Cape May Cafe for a buffet and it's $60 versus $100 or $130 per person at Takumi-Tei, I would go to Takumi-Tei in a second, no doubt. If you're paying out of pocket, it is very much worth the money to go and spend for that experience. The other thing that I would say is, it does take a little bit of preparation into your timing. One, there is a dress code. They don't want you coming in regular t-shirts and flip-flops, so we kind of packed some clothes with us and changed at the park. Two, like Ali said, it was nice to be able to come out of the park and not have something afterwards. So I would devote plenty of time with it. I wouldn't plan it where it's, hey, we've got to get to some other thing after the meal. Make it so that you know this is going to be an experience, and you're not going to be rushed, because if you're not rushed, you will get the full experience.
Yeah. So we hope you enjoyed this glimpse into our experience at Takumi-Tei. Like we said, it was unforgettable, and even, we're at home and we're still talking and raving about it. So with that, thank you for joining us. Leave a comment if you've eaten there. Make sure you like this video and subscribe so you can keep up to date with all of our future adventures.
And so with that, we invite you to set your imaginations free.